Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. Good morning, or indeed good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this webinar. I'm James Fowler. I'm the Market Development Manager for ICIS, and I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation, which is going to be jointly hosted by ICIS and our friends and partners in Brazil, Dcide. Before we start, I'd like to say a big welcome and a big thank you to Patricio Hansen, who joins us here from live from Campinas. He is the director of Dcide, and so I'd like to say a big thank you to Patrick and to your team for helping us put this webinar together and helping us to put together the white paper as well that accompanies this. It's been great working with you thus far, so hopefully we can continue to do this going forwards.
Thank you, James. It's been a pleasure to work with you on this white paper. I really enjoyed getting back to the natural gas business. I worked so many years back. And now this is being a very important issue in development here in Brazil, natural gas. So we're all very excited to see how it will develop and how can we all contribute to the success of it.
Yep, exactly. So today we're going to focus on the future role of LNG in Brazil's energy markets. And this is a webinar which goes along with the white paper that Dcide and ICIS put out a couple of weeks ago, which was on the same topic, talking about the outlook for LNG. And not just on the short term, but actually giving more of a midterm and longer term outlook about how LNG will have an impact on the Brazilian market going forwards, and what consumers in Brazil will need to know about the LNG market. Likewise, what global LNG players need to know about the Brazilian market and where LNG will fit into the supply mix. Now, there's a spate of new LNG import projects which have been proposed for the Brazilian coastline. We saw the entrance into operation of the first two privately owned projects in 2020 at Sergipe and at Açu. So while not all of these projects that have been proposed are going to be developed, there's definitely set to be an increased role for LNG in the Brazilian natural gas supply mix going forwards. Now, this ramp up of LNG interest in the LNG sector coincides with government initiatives to reform the Brazilian gas sector, following the passage of the lei de gás, that the new gas law that was approved by President Bolsonaro earlier this year. However, it's worth giving a deeper look into what the linkage between the gas market reform and LNG will be, how LNG is going to fit into Brazil's supply mix, and what will increased access to LNG mean for Brazilian consumers. Patrick and myself will discuss over the coming hour these kind of findings of our white paper. We'll review some of the main conclusions that we came to in that white paper. We'll also focus a bit more on the shorter term as well, because as I'm sure many of you know, there's a very sensitive situation right now in Brazil when it comes to the power sector, with the drought there and in terms of the low reservoir levels. So before we end, we'll also talk a little bit more about the short-term outlook, what that means in terms of the power sector, and also how that could impact the LNG imports in the gas sector as well. We'll also give you some time to ask any questions that you have before the end of this seminar. And so we will encourage you to put any questions that you have into the chat function. The webinar is going to be in English, but if you feel more comfortable typing your questions in Spanish or Portuguese, we have the capacity to be able to translate that and share that out amongst the audience. So please feel free to put in any questions that you have to the chat function. If we don't get to them in the hour, we will get to them afterwards. We will respond to you afterwards. So to start off with, I just want to give you a quick introduction to ICIS. ICIS stands for Independent Commodity Information Services, and we're a price reporting agency focused on the chemical, fertilizer and energy markets globally. In terms of energy markets, we're very well known for our coverage of the European gas sector. In fact, the primary European gas markets, the most liquid European gas markets, the TTF, the Dutch market and the NBP, the British market, those are our benchmarks. Those are the equivalents of Henry Hub in Europe. And those benchmarks, we are the benchmark for those physical markets, which means that a lot of the natural gas which is transacted on a daily basis, particularly in the physical market, is indexed to our numbers. That position of our European benchmarks also took us into the global LNG market, because we've seen so much more interest now globally in TTF because of the interlinkage of global gas markets. And so with the growth of LNG, you now have a lot of interest in TTF and what goes on in Europe and parts of the world, such as the Americas, also in APAC, where we're starting to see TTF used in contracts as well. So in the LNG market, we have a raft of different products, analytical tools, forecasts, which give you an outlook on how the LNG market is going to evolve, how supply and demand will evolve over the next 2 years. We've got our ship tracking platform, our trading platform, LNG Edge, as well as our editorial and pricing reports. Aside from gas, we also focus in on power and carbon markets. On the carbon space, we are the leading provider of information for the European ETS market, which obviously has had a big impact on TTF and on LNG markets as a consequence over the past 6 months. And we'll probably get into a little bit more about that over the next hour, as well as the carbon markets on this side of the Atlantic in the US, the WCI and the REGI markets. We've also had a commitment to working in emerging energy markets as well, and so we've been present in markets such as China and Mexico for a long time now, covering these markets, providing transparency in these emerging markets, and obviously we are looking at the opportunities as well in Brazil, and that's led us to work with Patrick and his team at Dcide. So Patrick, I'll let you give an introduction to Dcide and talk a little bit more about your company.
Yes, thank you. Well, Dcide is also a price reporting agency, another size, but we focus on the power market here in Brazil. And we're also obviously looking at natural gas and carbon certificates and so on, other products. But basically, we create quality price references for the industry. We also have proprietary software for risk assessment and control and pricing of transactions, apart from an ETRM system for all the invoicing and back office of transactions. So basically, these are in the slides are 3 products. Pool is this. It's a energy price references tool with forward curves, analysis, and reports. Then we've got risk for our risk assessment and control. And FMB is front, middle, and back office is our ETRM software. And obviously we've got training. Training on basically on risk, pricing, and consultancy, obviously to complement with our services. So basically we focus today on power markets, energy markets in Brazil, and looking also to expand as Latin America could eventually integrate in their energy systems.
Thank you, Patrick. So over the past few months, ICIS and Dcide have undertaken a study investigating the future role of LNG in Brazil's natural gas sector and how that's going to impact the wider energy markets in Brazil. The study was published in a recent white paper, which we launched last month. And over the next few slides, we'll share some of our conclusions with you from that white paper. Now, to start off with, I think it's important to discuss where LNG currently sits in terms of the Brazilian supply mix, and that's changed actually quite dramatically just over the course of the past couple of months. As you can see on this slide, Brazil's LNG imports, which is that chart with the blue graphic there, have been extremely volatile, and this volatility is really tied to the needs of the power sector. As is well known, Brazil's power market, or the capacity installed on Brazil's power grid, is very much hydroelectric dependent. And over the course of dry years, dry periods like we're experiencing right now, this dependency makes the system extremely vulnerable to a lack of water, and therefore requires the turning of new power capacity that's not hydroelectric, in particular dispatchable thermoelectric power capacity. So the lack of rain reduces operating capacity, and therefore you have to turn to these thermoelectric plants to meet the deficit that's left by the lack of or the reduced operating capacity at the hydro facilities. Now, LNG isn't the main source of natural gas in Brazil. Indeed, over half of the country's domestic consumption is currently met by gas which is produced domestically. You also have pipeline imports coming in from neighboring Bolivia, which roughly represent, on an average year, around about 20% of the country's needs. However, these two sources are really designed to supply baseload demand within the Brazilian market. They meet the kind of consistent appetite that comes from the industrial sector, from transport, from the residential sectors as well. And whenever you have that kind of big swing in terms of demand from the power sector, there's not enough spare capacity in the domestic production or in the import capacity to meet the needs of that sudden increase. And so what you get is this huge upswing in terms of LNG imports from the Brazilian market. As you can see in this chart here, the most consistent period for demand in terms of LNG was in the country's last dry spell, which really lasted from about 2012 to 2015. We regularly saw up to about half a million tons of LNG per month imported into the country during that period. And we appear, after a kind of lull through 2016 to 2017, even going into 2019, we appear to be experiencing another big increase tied to the very dry conditions that we're seeing right now in Brazil. A new record in terms of monthly LNG imports was set in October last year, and we're predicting future records to be set in terms of monthly imports over the course of 2021. Already this year, LNG imports are up 36% over the first 5 months of the year compared to where they were in 2020. And that's given LNG a 20% share of the supply mix, according to data provided by the AMP there, as you can see on the bottom right. Now, the surge in LNG imports comes at a time when Brazil's gas market is also set to undergo a dramatic change, thanks to new legislation which has been proposed by, or which has been passed by the current Bolsonaro administration earlier this year. Under the lei do gás, which was approved in April, the country's gas market will be opened up to private participation on a wider scale than it ever has been. Much of the legislation which has been passed focuses on reducing the power of the market control of Brazil's state oil company Petrobras, which until now has been the main player in the Brazilian market. In order to curb the influence of Petrobras, Brazil's hydrocarbon regulator will force gas pipeline operators to hold open seasons for capacity in the country's pipeline network. Private companies will be able to reserve capacity in those pipelines for the first time, taking control of their own supply destiny. This is also going to include capacity at injection points into the system. So, for example, producers will be able to book out capacity at compression stations feeding into the Brazilian pipeline network, or likewise, companies wanting to import will be able to take capacity at the import connection between regasification terminals and the pipeline network as well. Petrobras is also going to be forced to divest many of its physical assets, such as pipelines, and we've seen a lot of that process already kind of kicked off, and then also production fields and to provide footholds for the private sector to really move into that space. And as part of that process, Petrobras will also have to sell its stake in distribution companies. Now, a final aspect of the new market will be the transition in terms of planning for the network. Going forwards, companies can propose their own projects for development rather than having projects kind of identified and auctioned out by the central regulatory authorities. Now, the whole idea of the legislation is intended to develop a domestic gas market, bringing competition of supply that is intended to reduce the price of natural gas, which is paid by the consumer. It's also designed to spark development of a domestic natural gas market and also the hydrocarbon sector, providing a marketplace for a lot of the natural gas which is currently produced offshore in the pre-salt region, but is underutilized, either utilized instead for re-injection or in many cases kind of in certain cases also flared as well. Now, time is obviously going to be required to develop this domestic market and the infrastructure which will need to bring this gas on shore. You're going to need to have a price point which justifies the investment required to develop this infrastructure. And this consideration is therefore part of the rationale behind some of these new LNG projects which have been proposed for Brazil. Many of these LNG projects are tied to support specific demand centers, such as new power plants, as you've seen with Sergipe and Açu, which are shown on this map here. Also, you've got industrial facilities which are looking to tap into the international market, places like Barcarena in the north of the country. And while these projects start as isolated systems, because of the new law, you're going to have the ability to be able to propose and develop your own pipeline, connecting those projects into the main Brazilian grid. And that should therefore help to kind of broaden demand and create new demand within the country. Now, this exposure to global markets is going to bring price competition into the Brazilian market, and it's going to increase the risk that Brazilian consumers are potentially faced with. A look on this chart gives you a glimpse into how prices have changed over the past 3 years. It's actually it's quite funny if you look at this chart here and you look at the far ends, you actually see that prices are kind of in a similar position this time or right now than they were like 3 years ago. But if you look in between those two bookends, you can actually see a tremendous amount of volatility that's been experienced on the markets. And we've got here the Henry Hub price, which is obviously the US price. We've got the TTF price, which is our price, the benchmark for the European markets. We've also got the EAX price, which is the price of delivered LNG into the key East Asian markets of China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And then we also have included on here our Brazil DES assessment, which is the price of LNG delivered into the Brazilian market. Now, as you can see on this chart, international LNG pricing has been very turbulent. And we're at a point now where, as I say, prices are back up to around about on the LNG market $11 to $12, which they were probably at the beginning of this three-year period, as I've shown on here. And then in terms of domestic prices in Europe, the TTF around about the $10 per MMBTU mark. But if you look just a year ago, back in the middle of 2020, you can see how much prices have changed over that period. You're looking at a $2 price for TTF in this time last year, the same level as Henry Hub, and the same similar price in Asia and for the Brazil LNG price. In fact, over the period of the past year, we've seen a 5-fold increase in the price of LNG delivered into Brazil, where you've gone from about $1.70 per MMBTU to upwards of $10 per MMBTU in the current market. The obvious exception to this has been Henry Hub, where you can see the red line there has remained very, very stable. And for this reason, you're starting to see companies globally talk about potentially, well, Henry Hub offers some stability. That might be something that we want to consider if we're looking to start going into contract indexation, if we're looking to try and index our supply to a particular hub. That obviously offers some kind of predictability, but it doesn't offer the buyer much in terms of flexibility. You know, if you're looking at that, the LNG market, those LNG prices, what you have is a price that is reflecting to the conditions of the LNG market. And the Henry Hub price doesn't necessarily reflect those conditions. It's just a regional price for the North American space. If you're having a contract which is signed on a fixed premium to basis to Henry Hub. Obviously, it's going to remain the same whether the LNG market's at $2 per MMBTU or at $10 per MMBTU. And in the latter case, that's probably a good thing. But in the former case, it means you're leaving money on the table. It means that you are potentially not capturing the opportunities that seasonality and flexibility in the LNG spot market provides you. Now, as you can see on this graph, there's a much closer linkage to markets in Europe, the TTF, and the global LNG market than there is when you're comparing it to, say, the North American space. As an import region, the supply and demand fundamentals of TTF replicate those of the LNG market. And as a liquid market, it offers those exposed to global markets the opportunity to hedge their positions and manage their risks on the financial markets better than, say, a pure LNG indexation as well. So just to kind of conclude a little bit, just to conclude that the focus of the white paper and what we discussed about that before we get into the short-term outlook. If we're going to look at how LNG fits into the Brazilian supply mix, in the white paper, we identified both near-term and longer-term roles that LNG is going to fulfill in the Brazilian gas market. Now, in the short term, LNG is obviously going to play a role in meeting domestic demand from the power sector, but it's also going to be used to supply industrial demand as well. Basically, incremental demand, new demand that is seen emerging in the next few years from the Brazilian domestic market. LNG can play an important role as a market builder on that sense, because it gives you the flexibility for new players to be able to access new supply. The agility that's provided by the LNG industry, particularly the speed and the flexibility which is provided by the development of FSRUs, floating storage and regasification units, which can be plugged in to locations at relatively speedy timeframes, that's going to allow LNG to play a role as this kind of swing molecule meeting new demand from new markets, particularly at localized hubs around the coastline of Brazil. This flexibility is going to lead to LNG providing those kind of solutions that can get around the commercial or the physical bottlenecks that you might encounter in this market that is opening up. And in that sense, LNG can almost provide kind of a shock troop kind of role, breaking into the market, bringing cheaper priced natural gas to consumers, and thus helping to create the domestic market. In the longer term, the price diversity which is going to be established by this influx of LNG into the Brazilian market also enable the development of domestic natural gas production. And the pre-salt has ample supply of natural gas to bring this gas onshore from the offshore regions, and therefore to be able, this is going to help stimulate the creation of a domestic market which incentivizes the development of infrastructure to bring gas onshore from the pre-salts. To undertake these investments, Brazilian producers, Brazilian investors are going to require a market and an assurance that they're going to be able to make money from that market. And so a domestic pricing point which provides the signals required for investors is going to emerge, or will have to emerge, and this price will need to represent the supply and demand fundamentals of the domestic market in Brazil. Now, the good news for Brazil is that the country is well positioned to create that kind of price. Brazil enjoys a diversity of supply which many markets don't, and such as domestic production, pipeline imports from neighbors, and obviously LNG imports. Ultimately, you're going to have a market that can count upon 3 different price sets, which will bring competition, compete against each other, and therefore brings price diversity into the market, create arbitrage opportunities for companies that have access to these multiple different supply opportunities or these different supply options. And then by bringing that price competition into the Brazilian gas market, LNG is going to play a key role in helping to establish that price. In the longer term, that price may well be set by the cost of transporting gas from production centers in the pre-salt to the demand centers onshore. And by helping to create this demand, LNG may actually ultimately create a price which undermines its own market share. Indeed, you might see a position in the future where LNG could become the roof price for consumers looking to source natural gas, and that domestic price, which is created through the investments of infrastructure, bringing the gas onshore from the pre-salt, becomes somewhat of a floor price for the Brazilian market. The wider ranging ramifications of the creation of a domestic Brazilian also go beyond just the domestic gas industry. Such a pricing point will have impacts on the power sector, and Patrick's going to discuss a little bit more about that in a minute. But the impact could also be felt beyond Brazil's borders. Indeed, if you're looking at the South American space, given the absence of a liquid trading price for South America right now, should the Brazilian market develop as a domestic price or develop its own domestic price, you could have that price become the wider reference for the South American region. Brazilian consumption grows, we're going to see potentially increased interconnection between the regional countries to the Brazilian market, and as in that interconnection creates this regional South American market, ultimately you're going to have an interconnectivity which will put Brazil at the heart of the South American natural gas space and leads potentially to that Brazilian price becoming the reference price for the wider South American region. Now that's going to take some time, and obviously it depends a lot on the success that LNG has in initially breaking open the market over the next 3 years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the questions and the discussions that we have in the coming up. But before we kind of get to that point, I also think it's worth focusing on the shorter term fundamentals of the Brazilian market, in particular, given the current sensitive situation we're seeing with the power sector. And I'm going to hand over now to Patrick, who's going to discuss the immediate term outlook for the Brazilian power market and what the situation looks like on the ground there in terms of the droughts and the immediate kind of concerns for the power sector. So Patrick.
Okay, thank you, James. It was a good quick summary of what's in the white paper. I really invite everyone to read it, because we really go deep into all those details of what could the logic be of pricing. But then coming down to the specific situation of the power market, which will obviously be very influential on the development of the natural gas market. The crisis we are having in the power market today is a clear example of the necessity of a robust gas market to complement the power market. Basically, today, to give you a big picture, we've had the lowest accumulated rainfall in 90 years here in Brazil. So this is principally in the southeast, not in the north and northeast, no, but in the southeast region, which is basically the main consumption and production region. So the worst hydrology in 90 years. It's been very critical, and we've been through the last 7 years with below average rainfall. So we're really thinking that this is a major climate change, or maybe a cycle of lower than historical rainfall, or at least accumulation of water. But for example, today reservoir levels are at 30%, and we're still hardly at the beginning of the dry season. We still have June, July, August, September, October, until the rains start coming at the end of October, November. So this is very critical. The government is really with working very hard on trying to reduce the output of the hydro stations, the minimum output, because you've got restrictions of minimum output because of the river flows. You've got problems even with the transport system. You've got through the Rio Paranapanema, you've got transport of commodities and so on, which are being threatened by the low levels of water. So apart from the critical situation today, the fact that Brazil has been expanding in the last 15 years, basically with some hydro. The capacity of hydro has increased, but not the capacity of reservoir. So we've been building dams that are passage of water. We basically, because of an environmental policy, the capacity of storing water in reservoirs is diminishing, and the depletion of that those reservoirs is faster every year. Obviously, we've got a lot of renewable energy coming in with wind and solar, but actually the fact that we have a low reservoir levels, but we have a lot of capacity still of reservoir. Really, Brazil has a huge battery system, basically, because whatever energy you generate from either wind, solar, or thermal, you stop generating from hydro, which is about 20 years back, it used to be more than 85% of generation capacity. Now it's gone down to 60%. So you see the participation of hydro generation is falling every year, but on the other side, we have a critical climate situation, but still some reservoirs that can work as a battery for the whole system. So today, as James mentioned, the LNG imports have increased 36% in this year, and we expect them to be importing as much as possible, because now we're in a situation where whatever thermal unit is available to dispatch, they will be active. We joke here internally that we'll have to chop our grandmother's walking stick to burn it. But anyway, that's why LNG is so important and so critical for the natural gas, and for the natural gas development, and for the power sector. So today, as James mentioned, we've got Sergipe and Açu, 2 thermal units that are being dispatched straightforward. They have a higher price. They're being dispatched out of merit, basically, because the government planning system is basically allowing this dispatch out of merit. And this has been occurring for the last 7 years, where the planning committee has been allowing to generate thermal generation out of merit. Okay, so we expect this to continue happening, and this, as James mentioned, will demand LNG, which is the flexible gas that comes in and supplies those thermal units. Okay, and the problem this has is obviously EES, which is a charge, an energy security and services charge, which is now record high. Almost, I was reading, almost 600 million a month we are having. So it might reach up to 9 billion reais of cost of generating energy out of, for security reasons. So this has impacted severely on the tariffs for energy for both industrials and residentials. So the situation is critical. The dependence on LNG for the short and medium term, I think it's big. We see even it'll extend for 2022. And other things that are happening here is also Eletrobras privatization law, which is being currently discussed in Congress, might add about 6 gigawatts of base gas-fired thermal units to the generation mix. That would be basically with a 70% inflexibility. So this is a strategic decision, basically to support and bring stability a bit to the reservoir levels, the volatility of the reservoir levels, and also to develop the local natural gas market as you create the demand for the infrastructure to bring the pre-salt gas into the, basically it will flow to the northeast and north submarkets, and allowing this infrastructure to contribute to industrial consumption and develop the local gas market. There's also conversion of existing oil power plants into gas is already in action. Some contracts that are expiring in the next years will be transformed into gas, and as renewables are expanding, we've got a lot of investment in wind and solar. Brazil is very blessed by nature, as our national anthem says. No? We've got plenty of gas, plenty of wind, but obviously, as we all know, they are intermittent, and some thermal or flexible generation is very important for the stability of the whole system. So that's why cheap gas is crucial for the current, basically, and future function of the power market. Today, natural gas is not cheap here for industrials. It's quite high. Last May in Sao Paulo, the price was increased about 39%, basically because it depends on the dollar and other factors. So there is some volatility which really puts off the industrial desire to expand. But I guess now with this new law and with LNG coming as a front runner to develop this market for eventually local pre-salt gas to flow into this infrastructure, might develop the consumption of natural gas here in Brazil, not only for the power sector, but also for industrial sector. So basically that's the perspective. Today we have a very critical situation in the power sector, which will demand a lot of LNG to generate as much thermal energy as possible, I guess for the whole of 2021 and most probably for some time in 2022. The expansion of the capacity to generate through natural gas is very evident through both the Eletrobras privatization law and other initiatives, which even James mentioned before, private initiatives. So we see the strategic importance of natural gas within the energy sector in Brazil, especially because Brazil has that natural gas offshore. It's the pre-salt natural gas, but that needs also to be developed. So both sides, it's a win-win, both to develop the pre-salt and to lower the price of gas, which has been one of the promises that our Minister of Economy has put a couple of years back, but now we're in a situation where it's hard to deliver that. So I think that's why the government is so eager to make this happen in the best way possible. Okay.
Thank you, Patrick. Some really interesting insights there, and I think what you are talking about in terms of the way that the importance of the power sector to have access to cheap natural gas is something that we'll probably get a lot of questions about. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please type them in on the chat function. We'll get to them. If we don't get to them before the end of the webinar, and we will definitely respond to you outside of the webinar. So please feel free to put any questions in there. Obviously, in Spanish or in Portuguese, we can translate as well. So we encourage you to type any questions into the chat function, and we will endeavour to get to them. Before we get into the Q&A, I just wanted to show, tied to what Patrick was saying about the LNG or the power sector demand, how we at ICIS are forecasting LNG demand in Brazil over the next 24 months. This is taken from our supply and demand forecast. Now, the supply and demand forecast provides a 24-month outlook on LNG supply and demand in whichever country you are looking at from the global LNG market. It's a reactive forecast. So as and when we get a material circumstance, a material event which has an impact on the market, our analysts are working a way to update this forecast and to make sure that it reflects the current market situations. But what you can see on here is our analysts' predictions of how LNG demand will evolve over the next 24 months within the Brazilian market. And you can see we're already predicting potentially a rise up to new peak levels in terms of demand by the middle of this year, by kind of Q3 of this year, August, September. And that's tied to that situation at the dams, that reduced hydroelectric capacity, and the need for more and more imports, more and more LNG imports to feed into the power sector. Interestingly enough, we have a drop down next year in terms of demand, in terms of LNG consumption. And this is something that the analysts I know have been going back and forwards on. And Patrick, you've got your own views on this. A lot of our prediction, or a lot of our forecast, is taking into account that you're going to have the third big pipeline entering in from the pre-salt region, coming onshore, coming into the Comperj processing plant there in Rio, which would be the Rota 3, so the Rota 3 pipeline. And that's, when it comes online, has the potential to bring in about 20 MCM per day of natural gas from the pre-salt region into the domestic market, which would obviously improve the supply situation in the domestic market greatly. And so a lot of our predictions and our forecasts have been based upon that assumption. But like I was saying before, Patrick, you think that this probably is a little bit conservative in terms of 2022, and you, as you were alluding to before, you see the potential for there to be a higher demand next year than we're currently forecasting.
Well, yes, I guess both Sergipe and Açu might still be burning gas through January, February, that dip that you showed in the graph. Basically, it depends on the power sector planning agency if they allow this out-of-order dispatch, which, as the situation is so critical, it's so low, the reservoirs, which I believe this will continue, right? Dispatching energy out of merit and putting that charge on the ICIS charge, because it's for security reasons. That's basically, I think this might continue throughout our summer, no, which would be your winter. Obviously, if wood prices in the northern hemisphere influence that, I doubt, because the contracts basically here are already what we call the CBU, the price that the generators is compensated with. It's quite higher than the Henry Hub price, basically. So I think it'll still be important. Anyway, if they're dispatched, they will have to bring generate that energy. So basically, but anyway, the specific suppliers, they're integrated with their supply. The ASU, for example, the ASU power plant in Sergipe. So that's basically what I thought. Even though the Rota 3 can come in and supply, but I think this out of merit dispatch could boost still a bit more these two power plants.
So you mentioned the out of merit dispatch. I mean, how important is it to have a domestic price that reflects the fundamentals of the Brazilian markets? You know, a market-based price in terms of being able to re-establish that merit order, and in terms of being able to establish that to realign the merit order for the power sector. Is a domestic gas price in Brazil an essential part of realigning that, re-establishing that merit order, position?
Well, I think that's the long-term dream, to have some thermal units that have a reasonable price that you can dispatch them at lower. Today, all those thermal units have are way high in the merit order, and they have so a cheaper gas, a local gas price, or with local production and so on, would eventually allow us to bring those generation units down in the merit order. That would reduce the volatility in the prices, and also, as I said, we've got all these reservoirs which can act as batteries. So you can, in terms of, for security reasons, if there is this cheap gas, you can generate and store it as electricity in water in the dams. No? So I think in the short run, it's quite difficult, because you've already got these thermal units, ASU and Sergipe, they've already got PPAs with a fixed price. But in the long run, I guess the idea would be to have some other flexible generation which could really reflect the cost of gas, where the cost of generating electricity for the grid here would be more associated to the price of natural gas, and not to a CBU price which was determined in a specific auction. Okay.
You mentioned in the webinar, we talked a bit about this in the white paper as well, the outlook for new thermoelectric capacity, and obviously, given the situation as it is right now in terms of the drought and the hydroelectric, the lack of capacity at the hydroelectric facilities, there doesn't seem to be much wisdom in building new hydroelectric capacity. Will future grid additions in the Brazilian market, will gas or thermoelectric plants be that kind of default replacement for hydroelectric capacity, or is it going to be actually more renewables? Where does natural gas sit in terms of the future development of the Brazilian power market? Because it will be important in terms of creating a demand for natural gas internally, having some power sector capacity there. But is it automatically that the Brazilian market is going to go from building hydros to building more natural gas fired plants, or is it actually going to be more that renewables will be filling that void?
Well, I believe Brazil will continue building hydro, because there's still a lot of potential to expand the hydro generation, but not based on reservoirs, basically.
Right.
But the main expansion is occurring in renewables, wind and solar. There's a lot of private investment there, and I think that will lead. But obviously, the gas-fired power plants will have to come in to complement somehow. Okay, there is a kind of a natural synergy between an intermittent renewable with a hydro power plant where you can regulate, okay, but the thermal will definitely be important, and that's why we have these projects or even increasing 6 gigawatts of power plants to Brazil to develop the natural gas market, but also to bring stability and less volatility to the power market. So I was just reading some news, some paper about how would this expansion of this base load in natural gas-fired power plants could it eventually reduce the cost for final consumers? No, that's a bit of the argument. No, there's a environmental issue and there's a cost issue too. No? You have to balance both things. So Congress will be obviously trying to see which has the higher importance in that balance. No, is it because a thing of cost or environmental? No, and I guess the wind and solar will be the leaders in expansion, and that's what I still think is Brazil has a lot of potential there still, but also hydro with small reservoir capacities.
Just a reminder to the audience, we've got about 10 minutes left, so if there are any questions, please put them into the chat function, and we'll endeavour to get to them before the hour is out. But one thing I guess we were talking about, and one thing when we were planning this white paper, Patrick, was that we were there was a lot of questions from the Brazilian side, from the Brazilian Brazilian consumers about LNG and how it operates. What do you think are the main kind of uncertainties that the Brazilian audience, that Brazilian consumers have about the LNG space? What are their kind of questions, the uncertainties they have about the LNG market and how it could impact them?
Well, I guess the LNG, as we put in the paper, it'll be a bridge, no? But industrial consumers needs stability in prices, some guarantee. So to be subject to this volatility, I don't think they will be gambling on just buying at whatever price. So there should be some players that can bridge also the volatility to a more stable price locally here, maybe building a mix between local production and LNG to supply the industry. So the cost of gas here in Brazil for the industry is very high. So there is a lot of space a lot of fat to eat on. So a lot of business to build on reducing that price, and but also the stability is important for the demand to expand.
Yeah.
Obviously, the natural gas is still it's important. It's the driver to move the expansion forward, but the industry will require someone to bring a certain stability in prices. Okay, you're not going to build something where I can pay 15 or 3 dollars an MBTU. I think that's not very feasible, no.
So rather than exposing the consumer to the full price risk, it may well be that the initial kind of suppliers into the Brazil market, particularly if you've got LNG companies looking to use LNG as a supply source to build a market share or a position within the Brazilian gas market. They may even look at this as kind of like a loss leader kind of a project where, you know, the most important thing is to go in there, build a contract base, and if we have to eat a few cents in terms of the price volatility, the price is coming from the international market, we'll able to eat that in the belief that longer term we're going to be able to establish a position and optimize our supply with that kind of those supply options of LNG and domestic production.
Yeah, the industry will need some agreements, long-term supply with a forward curve, some references that can help them take decisions. I mean, to hedge their positions, and obviously there are a lot of registered traders or producers that can really build those services for the industry, you know.
Yep. Yeah, of course.
Arbitraging between the LNG and local costs.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly how our markets can develop, especially when we were saying in the white paper that you have this. Brazil is very well placed in the fact that you've got such a diverse array of supply options. You have the ability to be able to import through LNG, which probably right now is the most accessible because it can get you into new market areas. It can get you into it can get you around some of the bottlenecks in the pipeline system, but you will also have that domestic production, which with Brazil sitting on that ample supply from the pre-salts, and then also you've got that option of the Bolivia pipeline, bringing gas in through that, and there's been the so far limited success in auctioning that capacity, but there does seem to be interest there. I think that the market's just kind of waiting a little bit more for some signals, some kind of certainty to be able to take the position and being able to import through that TBG pipeline. And then in the future, you've also got potentially interlinkage with Argentina. That's a project that's being discussed right now. Whether that'll happen, I think is still something it's going to take some time, but there does seem to be commitment on both sides of the border to have an extension of that Uruguayana pipeline built into Brazil and access between Argentinian supply going into the Brazilian market. I guess one last thing that I would ask from your point of view, Patrick, being on the ground and having worked in the South American industry for so long, do you see anything that the Brazilian government could do more to accelerate the development of the natural gas market in Brazil? You touched upon the commitment to build more inflexible or more baseload power demand with this process of opening up, capitalizing Eletrobras. But do you see any other initiatives or any other policies that the government could pursue to be able to, accelerate that market development?
Well, yes, it'll all depend also on the different state laws. If there is a coherent market rule, if there isn't any issues between a specific state or whatever in terms of taxes. So all those issues will have to be solved in order to create a good, transparent and competitive market where you have federal legislation and then you have state legislation on taxation. So in order to make it easy to develop this market, there has to be a coherent regulation between the federal and the state. And as we mentioned in the white paper, if Brazil really succeeds in developing a market, there is enough activity, transparency, and liquidity and price references. I think that would even open up that possibility of a further integration in South America with Bolivia and Argentina, and Peru eventually. So hopefully that will happen. We all have our function in this. Obviously, ICIS, and they see that we're working on this and trying and hoping that this will happen. And hopefully we do have a good market with clear price references and attractive for both industrial and the power sector that can really make the best of this integration between renewables, intermittent renewables, and natural gas. So now we're almost finished our time, so we just hope for the best of this, and we'll work very hard for it to happen.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, Patrick, and thanks very much for all your contributions to the white paper and to this webinar. Thank you all as well for joining us. We really appreciate your attendance. If you have any follow-up questions, you've got our contact details there. Please let us know. You'll get a copy of the slide deck post webinar. But we are here to answer any questions that you will have following up, and we encourage you to go into the white paper as well and have a read of that. Come up and look at more of the conclusions that we identified in a bit more detail and a bit more depth. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much to Patrick. Again, thank you very much, CJ, and thank you very much to all of you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, James. It's been very, very pleasant to work together in this, and hopefully we can do more things.
Excellent.
Thank you all. Bye.